So one of the things that's special about Samburu land is it's desert country. And the Samburu, like the Maasai, are pastoralists. So they are herders. They have cattle and sheep and goats. And during the rainy season, which is very short in that part of the country, they can take their animals to water at any kind of an open river. But for a good part of the year, particularly in the dry season, these riverbeds all dry up. And what the Samburu do is they dig deep wells into the riverbeds to go down to the groundwater. And these wells are called singing wells. I knew this about the area, and I knew, since I was going in January, there was a chance that they would be visiting with their herds. The Samburu would be taking their herds to water them at the singing wells. So when I arrived, I asked Robert about this. I said, Robert, I've heard of the singing wells. Oh, yes, he said. It's dry season, so we're using our singing wells. I said, could I go? And he said, you want to go to the singing wells? I said, absolutely. He said, okay, we could go tomorrow morning. You can't take your camera because we don't allow any photographs. But I'd be delighted to take you. And it's a walk. Okay, I said. So we set off early in the morning, and it was hot. The sun comes up fast, and then it was hot and dusty. And we headed off from the lodge down this dirt trail. And this time, which I'd never experienced before, there was a ranger or a guard in a khaki ranger kind of outfit. So he was official with a rifle over his shoulder. And Robert in his gorgeous Samburu outfit, and me with a water bottle. And I'm not sure how far we walked, maybe a couple of kilometers, but he kept on stopping and asking me, Kathy, would you like to sit? Would you like to rest? Would you take some water? You better take some water. He was very concerned about me and very careful of me. And I said, I'm good. I mean, a couple of times we stopped for some water. And finally we arrived. I could hear all these bells. So some of the cattle and some of the sheep and goats have bells on them. And there was sort of, it was shrubby, there weren't tall trees. And he said, we're close. And I said, oh, I can hear the bells. He said, come this way. And then we went through this little path through the bush. And we came out on the other side. And I honestly felt like I had stepped into biblical times. Like I had gone through a veil. And before me was this long, dry riverbed full of cattle and tall, thin Samburu men and young boys. So the boys came with the smaller animals, with the goats and the sheep, and the men came with the cattle. And Robert and I sort of drifted in amongst the crowd. There were maybe 2,000 head of cattle there. The dust, everybody's lowing and mooing and baaing. And he, as we sort of passed them, these men would acknowledge Robert, and they sort of like, look at the white woman who was following him. And he took me over under a tree, and we sat down. And he began, it sort of also became self-evident in terms of what was happening. So all along the riverbed, there were holes, maybe 6 feet wide, maybe, at the most, holes that had been dug into the riverbed, dozens of them. And then as I watched, a Samburu man would come stripped down completely naked. So it was like this tall vanilla bean standing there. And he would take a little bucket the size of a gallon paint can, and he would disappear down the hole. And then that would be number one guy. And then number two guy would come, and he would follow him. And then there'd be a third guy. And these men were about at least 6 feet tall. So they're very tall. And I could hear from the well a song coming. And the song would kind of echo up through the well. And I said, "What are they singing?" And Robert said, "Well, they're singing their song." "Who are they singing to?" "They're singing to their cows." "Their cows know their song?" "Of course," he said. And at the top of the 6-foot well was a trough, hand dug log. And I would see the top guy's head would come out of the well and he would throw the water into the trough. So what was going on was they were basically standing on each other's heads. So they were at least 20 feet down into the well, standing on tiny little precarious ledges, and number 1 guy would pass the water up to number 2 guy, who would pass the water up to number 1 guy, would pass the water into the trough to the cattle. And the trough was not that long, so it could handle maybe 10, maybe a dozen cows. And the cows would drink, and then they would step away, and the next wave of cattle would come up. And I said, "It just looks so organized." And he said, "Well, it is." I said, how do the cows know? Oh, wait a minute, you answered that question. They're coming to their song. They know their own song. And how do they know to, like, who gets to drink first? And he said, "The cows, they figured that out." So if there were 200 cattle in one man's herd, it would, as you can imagine, it would take quite a while for this line of cattle to come and drink, and then they would move off. Wouldn't go too far. And then eventually the herd would be fed, and the men would come back out, get dressed, and take their cattle and hang out. It was also like a bit of a market day. They would chat, visit with each other, and then they would move off, and another group would arrive. So we sat and watched, and it's interesting as a photographer to have the opportunity not to have a camera, because I think I'm still looking through that lens and stamping the images in my mind's eye. And I can still picture the rhythm of the scene and the ancientness of the scene. I mean, they've been doing this for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Nothing has changed. And when they were finished, they would fade off back into the bushes to go wherever they had gone, and another group would come. And I said, "How far have these men come with their cattle?" He said, "Oh, I don't know, they've probably come anywhere from 15, 30 kilometers. I said, "And do they do that every day?" "Oh, no," he said, "they'll do that every 2 or 3 days." And of course, the men had nothing with them. They had their staff, and they had their animals, they had their weapons, they had their machetes on their waist, and their congas in their belt. And I looked at and there were these little boys who came. They seemed to just come on their own. And I said, "Well, those little boys have come with those goats that far?" "Yes," he said, "it's just part of their world." And I said, "And are they drinking anything today?" "No," he said. He said, "Well, they would have had some milk and some blood in the morning, because that's what the Maasai and the Samburu live on. They bleed their cattle and they mix it with the blood from their cattle, and that's their staple food. And that was it. So a little glass of milk and blood in the morning, take your cattle, 50 or your sheep, 15 or 20 miles, and spend the whole day out there and take them home again without losing anything to a leopard or a lion." And I looked at him and I smiled and I said, "Boy, you must think us white people are pretty high maintenance," because he was so worried about me with my water bottle. And he smiled and he said, "Yeah," he says, "that's what we call you, high maintenance." And I really don't have any more words for it. I just feel so privileged to have had this kind of an opportunity and experience, and to be invited into their world. of tradition and practice, knowing that there's lots and lots for me to learn from how they do things. We're always worried about educating and changing and bringing our culture to these Indigenous people. But really, what we should be doing is just sitting under the tree with them for a long time and listening and watching.